Welcome to the AIER's Authors Corners podcast. I'm your host, Ethan Yang, and today's guest is AIER Senior Fellow Robert Wright. Before joining AIER, Robert has taught at schools like NYU, UVA, and Temple. Robert, it's great to have you.
Great to be here, Ethan.
So today we're going to do something a little different. Usually we talk about publications that are, already out, but today we'll be talking about an upcoming publication, and it's to my knowledge that you have a new book coming out. Is that correct?
Hopefully,
yes, very assuring. So.
one never knows these days, but I tentatively titled it Liberty Lost, The Rise and Demise of Voluntary Association in Antebellum America.
All right, so that's obviously a very specific and unique topic. So I was wondering if you can give us maybe give our listeners a little taste of what they can expect in this book.
Well, if you know your de Tocqueville, lots and lots of corporations formed in early America. And I've already studied the for-profit ones and counted them. And now I'm engaged in studying the nonprofit ones and getting a count of them and trying to figure out what sorts of activities they did. So the first book was about banks and railroads and turnpikes and mills and stuff like that. This book is about churches and charities and societies for the betterment of the world in some way, shape, or form. Many of the earliest socialist movements, for example, were actually nonprofit corporations, which is a bit weird when you think about it. Mm-hmm. But almost everything in the nonprofit space was in the third sector, the charity space, was a nonprofit corporation before the Civil War.
And I was able to read the first three chapters or at least the first three draft chapters. And what I got from it was the book's fundamentally about voluntary association and the power of limited government and just allowing people to come together and create solutions for themselves and allowing to really just, build up from the ground up. And you talk about how the founders, this was essentially their fundamental vision for America, is to have this limited government system and voluntary association. And, clearly fast forward 200 or some years, clearly work, it's going pretty well. We've done a lot better than socialist countries, for example. So why is that? Like, why is voluntary association, limited government so powerful? And why don't we just have big government like everyone else wanted to?
It seems like it's much more efficient and much more socially cohesive to have ground up attempts at solving social problems. The top-down approach, especially a centralized top-down approach coming from a centralized government like Washington, D.C., they tend to create cookie cutter programs that might help a few people, but is not helping everyone, and may hurt quite a few people in the process. So why go through all those convolutions of defining the electorate and having elections that may or may not go smoothly to elect representatives who then may or may not act in the best interests of their constituents? Who knows what's in their own best interest but people themselves, right? So instead of the government taking resources from them and it going through that Cuisinart in DC or Albany or wherever, let people keep their own money. And when they see a problem, let them form an association to address that problem. And if it turns out that they're not very good at addressing that problem, well, then people will stop donating their time and money to it, and it'll go away. And maybe somebody else will come along and with a different approach that will work better. Or maybe the first approach will work well and will ameliorate the problem. Again, like we've spoken about in the past, nothing is ever really solved, right? It's mostly about lessening problems rather than solving them once and for all. And that's another way that voluntary associations are superior to government, because they're much more flexible and nimble. And if they're not fulfilling their mission, then they don't get donations and they dry up and go away. So they have incentives to try to figure out the best ways of achieving whatever their goal is, whether it's sending missionaries to the Antipodes or combating slavery or combating those god awful abolitionists, right? Because that's another thing about voluntary associations. They it might be trying to do something that you agree with, or they might be trying to do something that you disagree with, but you don't have to be involved if you don't want to be. There's nobody trying to take your money or that has the power of law to take your money and apply it to something that you don't agree with, unlike, say, with government.
And this reminds me a lot about a recent rhetoric from presidents like Obama, who likes to make comments like, government is things that we just come together, things that we do together. And you are, this voluntary association idea, it's fundamentally juxtaposed to it is that it's actually a little more democratic, because now everyone gets to say when it's voluntary, everyone gets to say in everything that goes on.
Oh, it's much more democratic. In a sense, it is, it's analogous to if we had a budgeting process whereby people got to decide the federal budget by allocating their own taxes paid. So maybe you're a war hawk and you want, all $1,000 that you're paying in taxes, you want earmarked for the military. Or maybe you want 500 to go to the military and 500 to go to, wealth redistribution or whatever. We can't do that in our current system. We have to elect or try to elect somebody, and hopefully our person wins. And then hopefully our person does what we want. Very seldom is anyone satisfied with that. In a voluntary system, instead of giving that money to the government, you get to decide how you spend it. Maybe you give $1 to 1,000 charities, or maybe you give $1,000 to the American Red Cross or some other charity that you think does a good job and ameliorates a problem that you think is most important. It leaves decision making decentralized and up to every individual, instead of centralizing it all in DC for people like Obama to decide how to spend. So you can see why governments were never really thrilled about nonprofits. What's happened is that governments have co-opted many nonprofits by supplying most of their budget. It used to be back in the time period that I'm studying before the Civil War that most nonprofits got most of their money from private donations. Well, now there are many nonprofits that get most of their revenue from government grants. And there's an old saying about the power of the purse. You follow whoever's paying you. So they're not even really independent entities anymore. So when you hear people say that the third sector is thriving, the nonprofit sector is thriving, it's because they're looking at the number of nonprofits and not where their funds are coming from and what exactly they're doing.
So that's certainly fascinating. And I think what you're getting at is it's a fundamental shift from, bottom-up solution where it's dynamic, it's market-based, it's people coming together to find innovative solutions to more so almost to a co-opted system where it's now top-down, the government's getting involved, and you definitely speak about this in your book. So to move on, you specifically study the antebellum period, which is pre-Civil War. So what's so interesting about that time period?
Well, it's a time period that I study most intensively. But no, seriously, there was a phrase that's been co-opted and has too much of a political connotation to it, so I won't use it right now. But it seems like many things we used to do better in the past than we do today. So maybe we should look back to the past and see how we used to do things, and maybe relearn those lessons so that the country can thrive again.
Yes, I'm assuming you're referring to a phrase that a former president would use, but we are not going to use here. AIER is a 501c3 nonprofit. We are nonpartisan. Let's move on to our final question. Obviously, with the book that's not published, we can't talk too much about it, but let's move on to probably the biggest question that's about the book, which is part of your title, is the decline of these voluntary associations. So can you give us an example of how is this decline happening? Where are we seeing it? And what do you think are the long-term consequences of that?
Well, we're seeing it across the board. It really started to kick in during the New Deal. It used to be, for example, back in the day that people would go to church and they would put donations in when the hat came around, or they would pay pew rentals and so forth that would support the church and its employees, but would also be used for charitable purposes. A lot of that went away in the New Deal. When it was crowded out by government. So then people are like, oh, why do we go to church now? Oh, because we sing and, say some prayers. Well, so church membership started to decline because it lost a lot of its meaning because it had been taken over by the state, essentially. Some of its key charitable functions. There used to be all kinds of fraternal, sororal, and maternal organizations in the U.S. And really the remnants of this is just like fraternities and sororities on college campuses and whatnot, and a little bit maybe with the Shriners and things like that. But it used to be that like half the men in the country belonged to some fraternal organization, and part of their functions were mutual aid and insurance that were taken over by for-profit insurers, which may not be a bad thing, but another big part of what they did was taken over by the government. And so why do we get together anymore? Maybe to drink, and that's it. But they used to get together and drink and actually, do something to help improve their community or some aspect of life. And you take that meaning, that purpose away, and membership inevitably declines.
So we're talking about almost a fundamental shift of meaning from communities being centralized in the government, essentially, through this gradual process of the incorporation by the state of these voluntary associations.
That's a great way to put it, Ethan.
That sounds like a very dark future.
Yes, and a dark present.
A dark present as well, yes.
So I'm glad that my draft wasn't so drafty. It was incomprehensible because I think very much you got the main point of it.
So when can we expect some sort of book to hit the market?
Next year, the year after that, possibly.
And what about the year after that?
I hope not. No.
All right. Well, thank you, Robert, for coming on our show and giving us a little preview of your work in progress. If you'd like to keep up with AIER's content, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, as well as check out our website at AIER.org. If you like what you heard and would like to support more of our research, more of this content, please consider being a donor, and you can find all that information and more at AIER.org. Thanks for listening.